Thank you very much for joining us. Very excited. Good evening. From your side, I know it's very late in Singapore, so we much appreciate you joining us today. And we're very excited for this conversation.
I'm very happy to join you too. But by the way, please call me Professor. I'm no longer an ambassador, and I'm not allowed to speak on behalf of the Singapore government. I'm only speaking on behalf of myself. Yeah.
For now, until you become a Prime Minister, you never know. Yes. So, Professor, let's jump into the conversation. I mean, everybody's very interested to hear the story of Singapore, what an amazing country has become in the last 50 years. From my point of view, what are one or two things that were a game changer that really kind of enlist the economic development we see today and the Singapore of today?
Well, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for 13 years, from 2004 to 2017, I would tell every student who came to the Lee Kuan Yew School the secret of Singapore's success. And I boiled it down to 3 words with the acronym MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. Stands for meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. And so I believe that any country can copy this formula. And meritocracy means, of course, that you select the best people. And by the way, not just best in terms of competence, but also best in terms of ethics. So they must be ethical and competent to serve in the government and the highest levels of government. That's meritocracy. And P is for pragmatism. And I always say that the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, the founding Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, used to say to me, Kishore, it doesn't matter whatever problem Singapore encounters, somebody somewhere has encountered that problem before. So why doesn't Singapore go and find the solution that others have found and copy and adapt the solution for Singapore? So Singapore succeeded by copying the best practices of the rest of the world. But the hardest thing to do, of course, is honesty. And because we had very strong leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, we were able to embed the culture of zero corruption in Singapore. And because of zero corruption, a country with no natural resources like Singapore has been able to accumulate some of the largest foreign reserves of any country in the world. So honesty means that the people benefit. So the answer is MPH, meritocracy, pragmatism, honesty.
I can't wait to say, I hope there's a book coming for that with the title. I just want to follow up on something important you touched on, the public sector. I mean, Singapore is very well known to have a very strong public sector. Please, could you talk a little bit more details about effectiveness of public bureaucracy and how you get there? How do you build that very well-known public sector that really drives everything? Very effective.
Yeah. Well, you see, the Singapore government believed that to succeed in government, you didn't just need good ideas, you needed to have good execution. And execution can only be done if you have a competent public service. And to some extent, the British left behind a reasonable public service in Singapore. But what we did was to make it better. And so I'll give you an example. In the British public service, if you wanted to become senior, you just have to wait. You have to wait 10 years to get promoted, let's say in the diplomatic service from first secretary to counselor, right? It was by age, by seniority. Singapore said that's wrong. Let's learn from the private sector. And so we learned from the Shell company, something called the HAIR system. HAIR doesn't mean H-A-I-R, hair. It means for helicopter and helicopter vision, analytical abilities, imagination, and reasoning. And so we look for people with these qualities, and quite often we promoted them faster. So in the Singapore public service, quite often your boss will be younger than you. And this would never happen in the British public service. So that ability to copy best practices from the private sector and bring them into the public sector also explains why Singapore's public service is among the best in the world today.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I was looking a little bit few days ago about your cabinet and the Minister of Trade or one of technology. Very young. I am very impressed with that. If you could talk about the applicability of Singapore's experience for other countries, people obviously talk about Singapore mode of development. Can Singapore approach work in other countries and countries in Africa?
Absolutely. The reason why I gave the MPH secret formula to every student of the Lee Kuan Yew School. In the Lee Kuan Yew School, by the way, only 20% of the students came from Singapore, 20% from Singapore, 20% from China, 20% from India, 20% from ASEAN, 20% the rest of the world, including some students from Africa. And I said, no matter what you live, no matter where your country is, if you apply MPH, any country can succeed. So I think certainly, countries in Africa, to answer your question, yes, they can succeed, but they will find that it's easy to implement meritocracy. It's easy to implement pragmatism. But pragmatism means you copy from the rest of the world. But honesty, establishing a culture of honesty and zero corruption is very difficult. And the reason why most developing countries fail is because of corruption.
Yeah. So innovation. I mean, I was reading an article a little bit from the Finance Times a couple of years ago about how Singapore is the front of the innovation around the world, and you have in technology in different areas. What's future is culture?
I think the culture of innovation.
Yes, sorry.
I think it took time. We had to accumulate resources. By the way, I have actually written a book called "Can Singapore Survive?"
Oh, good to know.
So all my essays. I've written 8 books, but 1 book was on Singapore. So some of the points like the meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty can be found in that book, "Can Singapore Survive?" And in terms of innovation, it's a combination of factors. You see, our first generation of leaders, Lee Kuan Yew, Gopingchi Rajarnam, as I mentioned earlier, were very brave and entrepreneurial, and they would be ready to do things that other countries had not done, right? And they would, for example, Dr. Gopingchi built an industrial park before any investments were coming. He just said, no, we'll build, and then the investments will come.
Yeah.
And of course, over time, we really accumulated a lot of resources, and we invested the resources and wisely, and we invested them in good universities. So the 2 top universities in Singapore, the National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University, are among the most highly ranked universities in the world for a small country like Singapore. So creating strong universities does fuel innovation.
I see. And you talk a little bit about the founders of Singapore, and the famous, of course, is the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Lee. Could you talk about a little about his legacy and what made him unique and successful?
Well, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was an exceptional man. Singapore was very lucky that for a small country like Singapore, we managed to get someone like Lee Kuan Yew who was respected by world leaders, And when I served as ambassador to the UN in the 80s, my counterpart was General Vernon Waters from the United States of America. And General Vernon Waters was very close to President Richard Nixon. And in the 80s, as you know, United States was very worried about the Soviet Union. And General Vernon Waters said he told President Richard Nixon, he said, thank God Lee Kuan Yew is only the leader of a small country like Singapore. If he was a leader of a big country, then the United States and Soviet Union would have to combine together to deal with Lee Kuan Yew. That's a great compliment to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And, you know, I remember attending a private meeting in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the 1990s. And when the former president, Father Bush, George H.W. Bush, was asked, who's the most impressive leader you met in your life, he mentioned Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had an unusual ability of having a great intellectual mind. And he was amazing intellectually. And yet at the same time, he was a doer. He was not an academic. He would get things. So it's very rare to have someone who's brilliant intellectually and also very effective at execution. And this is this combination of these two characters, plus the ruthless honesty that he had, that explains why he was such an exceptional leader.
It's very, very interesting. For the listeners, there are very interesting bios about him, and therefore you should get to some of the books. So a little bit, I want to touch a little bit about the present. How do you see the Africa relationship look like for you? And what's Singapore's strategy in Africa, in your view?
Well, I think Singapore would love to have closer relations with the African states. Our problem is that we are very small. We have a very small foreign service, so we are not able to have many embassies in Africa. That's a pity, you know. Although we have created a system of what you call non-resident ambassadors. So in many African countries, there's an ambassador resident in Singapore who travels to the African countries to develop their relationship. So Singapore would be happy to do more with Africa because there's natural complementary. Singapore is one of the tiniest countries in the world, you know. And just to tell you how tiny it is, you know, next to we are neighbors of Indonesia. And there's a huge island in Indonesia called Sumatra. On this island in Indonesia, there's a mountain. You have to drive to the top of the mountain. There's a lake on top of the mountain. In the middle of the lake, there's a small island. And the small island in the middle of the lake on top of a mountain is bigger than Singapore. So now you know how Singapore is. So when I go to Africa, for example, I'm amazed at how much land and how much beauty Africa has. By the way, I've only visited Kigali once, but I want to come and spend some time in Rwanda, which is why I'm so happy to do this talk with you, because I really would like to come and visit you and to pay my respect to your President Paul Kagame, because I met him a few times in various international fora, and I have a lot of respect for him, but I want to come and pay my respect to him in person when I go to Rwanda.
I mean, I don't know if you know this, I'm a very, very advocate of Singapore and African shipping, go on the next stage, because I feel there's so many African countries can learn from Singapore, face almost the same challenges being small countries, especially like Rwanda. And Singapore is a good role model for many countries in Africa in terms of how you move a country from, poverty to be a developed country. But just a little bit, I want to talk subject to you have been writing a lot about. Could you talk a little bit about the power shift from west to the east and the rising of Asia, and what this means for the world and the future, by the way? Could we talk about Africa or the future of international cooperation?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned earlier, I've written several books, and my two latest books especially has The West Lost It, which is a small book, and Has China Won? Basically document also how power is continuing to shift back to Asia. And I say shift back because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. But the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. All aberration come to a natural end. So it's perfectly natural to see the return of East Asia. In the case of China, of course, it's growing very fast because in 1980, 41 years ago, China's GNP in purchasing power parity terms was only 10% of the United States, but by 2014, it had become bigger. And so the return of China, India, and the rest of the Asian states is perfectly natural. And therefore, I think it would be good for young Africans to spend more time studying Asian countries and working in Asian countries. Because, I always say that Europe represents the past, America represents the present, and East Asia represents the future.
I see. That's very interesting. So, I mean, the pandemic, COVID, a lot of things to touch on here, but if you look how countries respond to COVID, especially developed countries, why many countries are not ready for this pandemic? Even our international system, I think, was not ready for this.
Well, I think that it's actually quite shocking. If you had asked me 2 years ago, before the pandemic broke out, if we have a global pandemic, which countries would handle it better? I would say it would be the advanced countries of the United States or Europe would handle it better. And I would say we in Asia, we would struggle, East Asia especially. But amazingly, as I said in an article in The Economist, the opposite happened.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the number of deaths per million, in many European countries is 1,500 deaths per million. Even the United States is 1,600, 1,700 per million. But if you look at the East Asian countries, majority of them is below 50. Below 50. So, and this is quite shocking,
Yeah.
So as I said in an Economist article, in some ways, the competent response of the East Asian countries to COVID-19 shows that actually that power is really shifting to Asia, and it is accelerating the arrival of the Asian century.
I mean, it's very true. I think it's moving faster than people even expected. They will say, Asia is in the next 10 years. I think it's now, actually. What can countries do to mitigate the risk of COVID to the economy, in your view?
Well, I think every country has got to find its own solution. But the important thing is to protect the population, right? And I think I would say that it would be good for African countries to learn from East Asian countries because they've done a better job than the European countries. Because in the European countries, what they focus on is the rights of the individual and not the responsibilities of the individual. So as you know, many Americans, including President Donald Trump, refused to wear the mask because they said, I have a right not to wear the mask. But actually, when you wear a mask, it's not just a right, but it's a responsibility you have to your fellow citizens because you must protect your fellow citizens. So in Singapore, mask wearing in public is compulsory. You have no choice. Yeah. And we are also, whenever we go anywhere with our phone, we have to register that we've been to a place so the government knows who's been in a certain place. And if the COVID is found there, they can find the people who were close to the COVID person who was infected with COVID. So I would say it's good to learn. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. This is what pragmatism is about. This is what is copying best practices is all about. So I would recommend that African countries come and learn from East Asian countries on how to manage COVID-19. And much of this you can Google and get publicly, by the way.
Yeah, true. It's very impressive looking at the numbers in Asia, how you deal with COVID. But the last question in terms of COVID, but how do we turn this into opportunities once it's over? Or how can we turn this into an opportunity once this COVID is over?
Well, I think after COVID is over, we should realize, I think what the message that COVID-19 is telling us is that humanity is one. And in another book of mine, The Great Convergence, I say that in the past, when 7.5 billion people live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats. Each country was a separate boat. So if COVID-19 hit one boat, it wouldn't hit the other boat because you're in separate boats. But with the world having shrunk, the message that COVID-19 is teaching us is that all 7.5 billion people now live not in 193 separate boats, but 193 separate cabins on the same boat, which is why every cabin is infected by COVID-19. You can't escape COVID-19. So the lesson is we are on the same boat. So the opportunity we should learn from COVID-19 is that the world must come together to strengthen global multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization. So as I say in the Great Convergence, it was a mistake for the West to weaken the WHO. We should strengthen the WHO and give it more resources.
It's interesting you touched on the international cooperation. Very interesting to hear your view on this, because if you look, Brexit, Trump, this rising of, I think, globalization. Just for just a quick question: do you really have hope in the future of international cooperation?
Well, I think I'm glad that President Joe Biden won the election. And if President Trump was still president, I would say there's no hope for international cooperation. But I'm glad that President Joe Biden won the election. And I'm glad he's come back to rejoin the World Health Organization.
Yes.
I'm glad he's come back to rejoin global cooperation on climate change. So I think I'm more hopeful and more optimistic under President Joe Biden.
Yeah. So last question before we jump with the question from the audience. A little bit about your book. Just reading your book, which has China Won, which is actually very fascinating. It came out last year, and for the audience who have not read it yet, and I hope they go read it. What's the case you're making here for this book?
Well, I think basically I make the case that in the next 10 to 20 years, the whole world will be rocked by a major geopolitical contest between the United States and China. And you notice that even though President Trump left, in fact, in the first sentence of my book, Has China Won? I say, and I wrote this before Biden won the election. I wrote this in the middle of 2020. I said that the US-China geopolitical contest has begun. It will outlast Trump. So even if Trump loses the election, it will continue. And I made that prediction, and you can see even under Joe Biden, the US-China geopolitical contest is continuing. You saw the Alaska meeting, you saw the quarrel between Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Yeah.
So I try to explain what are the structural forces that are causing this contest. And since it will affect every country in the world, including Rwanda, I hope that people in the Rwanda will also look at my book, Has China Won? Because its goal is to help countries manage the biggest geopolitical contest that we have ever seen in human history.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, actually. There's a few points you make that most people, I think, don't realize that in terms of the rising of China. Anyway, but let's jump into questions from the audience. We'll go off the record. Please, Estelle, send us questions. All right, so this is all our time. Professor, thank you very, very much for your time. It's very interesting conversations, and we look forward to have you in Rwanda at some point when you come. We'd definitely love to have you speak to students or some universities, or our members, actually. For everybody, thank you for joining us. One thing I want to remind you, the professor's book has China Won. It's on Amazon, and if you can't have access to Amazon, you could Kigali Heights, they have, you could order the book from Kigali Heights Library. So please look into the books. Very fascinating. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. And I look forward to seeing you in Rwanda.
Yes, please come to Rwanda soon. Have a good one, Ambassador.
Bye-bye.
Bye.